It is my great pleasure to introduce a colleague from University College London, Brian Klaas, sat behind me, who is a professor of global politics. He has a huge amount of experience dealing with politics firsthand, having worked with governments, including leading a political campaign, having worked with large corporations and NGOs all throughout the world. If you look at his biography, you'll see how impressive the work is that he's done. He used to write columns for the Washington Post, and that's where you might have encountered him. He's since switched to The Atlantic, which, as you know, has done a great job covering conspiracy theorizing and has a monthly column with them. He also writes books. And he's written 4 books to date. The first one is called The Despot's Apprentice, which is about Trump. The second one, The Despot's Accomplice, which is kind of about us. A book, How to Rig Elections, and the last book called Corruptible, which is very, very new. Now, I looked at some of the reviews online of his books, and they're very, very good. I mean, he has nearly 5-star reviews all across. The last book, the latest one, Corruptible, is described as the freakonomics of political science, and a book that is as riveting as any crime novel. I mean, that's pretty good. In the polarized world in which we live, it'd be surprising if there weren't some other reviews as well, and so I had a look at those. And the one that I think really did it for me is the following. It says that the author is biased because he lives in Britain, where they have long forsaken any semblance of free speech. That's precisely why our great founders rebelled against the British, and signing off with, God bless President Trump. On that happy note, over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's my great pleasure. I'm sorry. Thank you. It is my absolute pleasure to be on stage with Frances Haugen, who is a person who became a household name in America and around the world a couple years ago. In September of 2021, there was this news story that broke that there was someone at Facebook who was going to tell Facebook secrets to the world and some of the very dangerous and damaging things that were going on inside that company. And in October of 2021, the world found out that it was Frances. And Frances has been a whistleblower who has been a force fighting for better ways to make social media safer for us all, especially through non-content moderation, non-content adjustment ways that could be easy tweaks to make it much more safe and viable for the long term. And Frances is a data scientist and an expert on algorithms, published widely, interviewed on every major news outlet in the world that is worth talking about these things. 60 Minutes did a huge expose with Frances as well, and it's a huge pleasure to be in conversation with you. Now, I want to start by asking you, when you began this journey of unmasking yourself as the whistleblower, did you expect that more would change in the last 2 years? Did you expect that this would produce more pushback when people actually understood what was going on at Facebook?
So I had incredibly low expectations when I came forward. Like, my main thing I was optimizing for was I wanted to be able to sleep at night. That this didn't get as much coverage in the United States, but I wanted people to understand that Facebook is the internet for maybe 1 billion or 2 billion people in the world. And they're in very vulnerable places. And they're the same places that Facebook doesn't spend money on safety. We should expect to see repeats of things like Myanmar and what happened in Ethiopia over the next 20 years. So that's all I wanted to accomplish, was I didn't want to know that I held that secret in. But since then, it has been just beyond my wildest dreams, right? So the Digital Services Act struggled to pass for about 4 or 5 years. And I think the information in it was the information in my disclosures was really helpful for pushing it over the final line. And that's the first law anywhere in the world that says when we ask questions of social media, we deserve answers. It sounds really simple, but we've never had it before. And the other thing that I never expected to happen was in the United States, the most senior medical officer is called the Surgeon General. And in the last 60 years, like since the 60s, there have been maybe 10 to 15 health advisories from the Surgeon General. And they're things that we kind of take as like, duh, kind of things today. It's like cigarettes cause cancer, seatbelts save lives, breastfeeding is good for babies. Like it's all stuff like that. And maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago, the Surgeon General came out and said, we have a public health emergency. Rates of suicide are hockey sticking for children, and social media use is a direct connection on it. And historically, within 2 or 3 years after a declaration like that, there's been some kind of movement in the United States, either at the federal level or like the tobacco lawsuit through the attorney generals. And I'm very optimistic that we'll start to see something, at least around kids, in the next couple of years.
One of the things that you've advocated for is adjusting the news feed at Facebook, making it chronological. And many of you will have seen in the last day or so that there has been a new study out in which some researchers tried to adjust some of the parameters in ways that you had suggested. And the headlines would suggest that they showed that they did not work. Now, I've spoken to you before about this, so I know that you're very skeptical of this research. Explain why you think that this research doesn't achieve the things that the headlines say it does, where Facebook or Meta now is claiming vindication.
So for context, for people who haven't been like watching the news like hawks in the last 24 hours, yesterday evening, so yesterday afternoon in the United States, 4 major papers and like a parallel report on the process of the research all were published in Science. And Facebook took that moment to put out a press release to say, our algorithms are not driving polarization. That's what those studies said. And the Wall Street Journal did a wonderful piece today saying, a week ago, Science, the publisher of the research, said, hey, if you come out and characterize this research as an exoneration, we will publicly refute you. And Facebook did it anyway, because they do what they want to do. The study in question said, okay, we're going to take the newsfeed for the 90 days before the election, and we're going to turn off the algorithms. So some people are going to get chronological, some people are going to get the normal experience. And surprise, there's no impact on people's ideology or political opinions changing. One of the things that's so interesting about this study is the product as it is today is designed in such a way that it can only operate with an algorithm. Facebook has been pushing people into 100,000, million-person groups for years. And often those people don't even know it's happened. If you get invited to a group, it's considered a join if you interact with any of the content they show you in the next 30 days. That's not an invite. In the run-up to January 6th, they found that the top person who invited people to stop the steal groups invited 330,000 people. And those 330,000 people, that's just one of the people who were super inviters. They got all of that content for the 30 days before January 6th, right? But if you just go and switch off the algorithms, people are still in these, groups that are like fire hoses. If you have a 1 million-person group, it's going to have 1,000 pieces of content a day. Your feed is now just a wash in randomness. To say that that is the experiment that exonerates the algorithms, I think is really, really reductive. But it's what Facebook's saying.
And you've said to me as well that there's also, this was the safest point for Facebook, is that right, during this study period. Why was that? Could you explain that a bit?
So in the run-up to the election, so a year before, so I just had a memoir come out called The Power of One, and I talk about how a year before all this happened, the election happened, they held a red team. So, blue team's the good guys, red team's the bad guys. They brought 50 people together who understood how Facebook was vulnerable. They asked them, imagine how the site could be compromised. And they came up with a huge number of vulnerabilities. They noodled on all those things, and in the 90 days before the election, there were at least 40 interventions on the site where they just changed the knobs. So this is things like live video on Facebook has been known to be a vulnerability for years. So the Christchurch shooting, this guy live cast murdering 14 people. And Facebook didn't take it down because it got detected. They took it down because the police wrote to them and said, please take this down. Right? Think about that for a second. The reason it didn't get shown for review was they only had expedited reviews for suicides, not murders. Right? So for live video, for the 90 days before this happened, they said, let's not amplify this 850 times more than it deserves. Like we right now have this huge boost to make sure it always goes to the top of your feed. Given that we know we can't handle this, maybe we shouldn't amplify it that much in the run-up to the election. So it's also one of these things where they're saying, we ran an experiment in the United States with the safest settings we've had on in 5 years. This is representative for Facebook everywhere in the world, when we don't even have content moderation systems for, any but maybe 40 languages, 50 languages, in a world with 5,000 languages.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about that since you mentioned the global aspect of this. I mean, I think that a lot of us have experiences of social media in a very regulated world. Regulated relative to, say, sub-Saharan Africa. And we also experience the internet outside of Facebook. So could you talk a little bit about the dangers that you saw inside the company in terms of how there's non-scalability for things like language moderation, and also some of the dangers that we might be blind to in Western democracies where, relatively speaking, we have more oversight?
So Facebook does not allocate spending based on absolute need. They do it based on fear of consequences. So if you were to look at where the money gets spent on content moderation, disproportionately it's in English. So one of the documents I brought out had, for the operational budget for misinformation, 87% of it went to English in 2020, right? Only like 9% of speakers on Facebook speak English. Why do they do that? It's because while Facebook likes to believe they are like above, countries, they are in fact a US corporation. And so making sure that it is cleaner, less offensive in the United States is a business decision. I think part of why Europe was willing to act on the DSA is because there's a lot of languages in Europe that didn't have any moderation, or very, very little moderation. I've talked to journalists in Norway who've tried to report suicide promotion content, and none of it gets taken down. And I assume that's because there are no Norwegian moderators.
I wanted to also pick up on what you said about the individual that invited 330,000 people to a single group. Could you talk a little bit about these sort of hyper-vigilant users that are extreme, and how Facebook or other social media sites might mitigate that content without impacting the site for the normal user base, as it were?
So one of the things I always talk about is your uncle, your neighbor who has the weird conspiratorial ideas, they are not the problem. Right? Like the people who are actually introducing your uncle to the interesting ideas are people who are actively pushing out ideas. So there's like a very small percent of users who are these hyper sharers. And they've done experiments where they do things like say, hey, if you were to post a whole bunch, we'd call you a spammer. Right? If you email a lot, you're a spammer. We demote those posts in the newsfeed. If someone reshares a lot, maybe we should also give a little demotion to those as well, because you're not really being as judicious about it. And unsurprisingly, when you do that, you get less misinformation and less hate speech. There's a lot of these little tweaks where you can come in right on the edges. 99% of users are never going to see a different experience on these platforms. But that 1% that's like actively figuring out how to harvest content from groups and redistribute it, that kind of thing, you take those super connectors out of the matrix, and the behavior of the entire system changes really dramatically.
Another thing that's going to change very dramatically is content moderation with things like generative AI, which we've been talking about. And when you were a whistleblower 2 years ago, obviously this was on the radar, but it's exploded in its impact on the broader world. What do you see as the ways that this is going to affect the problems that you already highlighted in your comments and in your memoir and so on?
Sure. So one of the things that I've been talking about since my first testimony, so the Wall Street Journal did a big expose in December of the year I came out about how much money Facebook spent on lobbyists promoting the idea that the thing I wanted, like the reason I was out there, was I wanted more censorship. My very first Senate testimony, I was clear. The problem with all classification systems, so a classification system says this is hate speech, this is not, this is violence inciting, this is not, is that you have to trade off between getting all the bad things, between getting all the bad things and being wrong. Like if you want to get all the bad things, you have to accept that sometimes because language is imprecise, you're going to take down good speech. And that has real consequences. I've talked to women who advocate against violence against women all around the world. It could be in Brazil, it could be in Germany, it could be in France, anywhere. I've done a lot of things with civil society groups. Every single group I talk to, they're like, our entire leadership team has had their accounts taken down. because the AIs can't tell the difference between someone talking about violence against women and someone committing violence against women. Or like in the case of terrorism, one of the papers in the Facebook files explains how because they didn't spend adequately to do high quality Arabic classification, so Arabic isn't one language, it's like 6 big language families that are dialectically different. Because they didn't spend on really making sure they were doing a high quality product, because no one can see how high quality the product is, 75% of counterterrorism posts were being classified as terrorism. Think about that for a moment. The number one thing that fights terrorism is communities de-radicalizing themselves. It's not drone strikes. It's like aunties being like, hey, that sounds like a bad idea. And we're taking down those posts. The thing that gets me nervous is, so we already know that's a problem. Like that was a problem 2 years ago. The difference today is 2 years ago, we knew that there was adversarial AI. So adversarial AI is what it sounds like. So people go in there and say, can I trick the AI? And it's pretty cool, like go Google it. You can take an image of like a panda, and you can take some stuff that looks like noise, and you can superimpose them, and it still looks like a panda. But now the AI will say that's a monkey. And it's because the AIs aren't structured knowledge, right? They don't have wisdom. They have inferred insights. So in the world that is about to begin, which is when the DSA starts giving rights around saying you get to know when you get demoted, you get to know when your content gets taken down. And even today, you know your content got taken down. You just don't know the demotion part. You can train your generative AI with that feedback, and it can just wiggle the pixels. You know, the picture even looks the same. The words are almost the same words. They're just ordered in a slightly different way. And now you get through the content moderation. We are living in a world where content moderation is about to end. And the second thing I'm super nervous about is truth lives in a very small radius, right? Consensus reality. We can have our own interpretations on it. We can argue about the boundaries of it, exactly what the shape is. Reality is real. Misinformation gets to play in the entire scope of ideas. You know, the reason why misinformation feels so seductive, you know, it plays on what you want to be true, because it can play anywhere in that space. It can be the French fry to your brain when truth is kale, right? Kale is delicious, but French fries, they seduce you. When we get into the world of generative AI, you can now generate 10,000 different lies and figure out what goes viral. Like, we're gonna be playing on a very, very different game. And the thing that I'm hoping is, the thing I wanted when I came forward was for us to start talking about how do you design social networks to be safe by design? Like, how do we study how information flows? How do we put in moments of intentionality and friction? You know, how do we make these systems be ones that we don't need to censor because they're not amplifying the most extreme stuff? I'm hoping that those worlds are important because they translate into every language. Like, you don't have to rewrite those language by language by language. They just work. I'm hoping that the rise of generative AI means we are forced to do those kinds of things, even if it trades off a little bit with usage or a little bit with profitability. And I'm not saying 50% of profitability, I'm saying 1 or 2 or 3%.
Yeah, so just to pick up on that, I mean, in the dynamics that you blew the whistle on, it seems that there is a sort of corporate structure that is making a very clear distinction between profit and safety, and is choosing profit, right? That's the sort of picture that we see. And yet it seems so unbelievably bizarre that you would sacrifice safety and the long-term viability of a platform for 0.1% of the profit.
Great question.
Right? So why that trade-off? Is it short-term thinking? Is it indifference? Is it genuinely apathy and not caring? Or is it the banality of evil? I mean, what is going on behind the scenes in terms of the decision-making to come up with, yes, 0.1% profit is worth something that's unsafe?
So I have an MBA from Harvard. Like, I really am passionate about organization design, like organizational health, and which is a little bit of an anomaly for people who really like algorithms also, but I wear many hats. And I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than all those things you said, right? Like, a big part that I unpack in my book is the idea that Facebook had an ideology internally that devalued individual judgment. So if you go watch a bunch of Senate testimony, famous line from Facebook execs, they're like, who's responsible for X? And they're like, a committee decided that. Right? Like, there's no individual responsibility. There's not really a culture of saying, you saw something wrong and you raised your hand. Because no one has to sign their names on a change. A committee approves a change, right? No one's really responsible. But they have they have what they consider to be an ideal operating environment where everyone is equal, right? In a world where metrics decide what is good and bad, then anyone can propose a change and be like, oh, the metrics went up, your thing is better. And that's good from the perspective of Facebook believes that young people drive innovation on social media. They need to have an operating system where a 22-year-old can challenge a 32-year-old or a 42-year-old, if you can imagine a 42-year-old at Facebook. Very young culture, very, very young culture. At Google, there's a thing called, so think of, if you're a Google employee, you're a Googler. If you are gay, you're a Gaygler. If you are over 40, you are a Graygler. Contemplate that. At Facebook, the equivalent is Facebook seniors, and that's over 30. Like, how would that impact your corporate culture? So in an environment like that, unless you have the ability, like you have a culture that says, hey, sometimes you're gonna have to wiggle things. Like, it's okay to have, like, there are changes documented in the Facebook files where it's like 0.1% less profit, 10% less misinformation. 0.1, 0.2% less profit, 30% less hate speech, right? Because there isn't any equivalency where they say, hey, 10% of misinformation is worth 1% of profit. Because there isn't that kind of thing, because that would require judgment, right? Those aren't absolutes. They kind of fall through the cracks at Facebook.
I'm cognizant of time, so I want to make sure we have time for some Q&A, so just a couple left. But I want to ask you the difficult question, but do you have one specific tweak in the short term that you think is most realistic and would have the most bang for buck? And what should be the long-term goal of reforming social media companies?
Ooh, great question. So, remember, there are many stakeholders, and we have to optimize across them. So if I get one magic bullet, we've known for 20 years that if you make software a tiny bit slower, like we're talking 5, 10 milliseconds slower, like imperceptibly slower, people use it less. I would say the single easiest problem to solve on Facebook right now is sleep deprivation. Like really, like kids and sleep deprivation, Instagram, bad news. Like that's gonna stay with them for the rest of their lives. Even adults, I'm a doom scroller, YouTube is my vice, I'm not above this. Imagine if at 10 a.m. in the morning, after someone is up late on Facebook or on Instagram, a little thing popped up and said, when do you want to go to bed tonight? And you say, maybe it's a kid. Maybe they're like hungover on Instagram in math class. They're like, I want to go to bed at 11. My mom wants me to go to bed at 10. And for 2 hours before that, Instagram gets a little bit slower and a little bit slower and a little bit slower and a little bit slower. You don't even notice it's getting slower. And around your bedtime, you just get tired and go to bed. That feature is live on Instagram today if you're stealing content from Facebook, right? Like if you're downloading content from Instagram, if they get rid of your account, it'll just get a new account. So they slow your account down, hoping you won't notice, right? They could launch this in 2 weeks if they wanted to. On Facebook, they've done studies. They know what the people are like who consume the most content on Facebook. They can go, they've done studies where they have people have software on their computers, or they'll go look at who leaves which comments. If you're in the 99th percentile on Facebook, you're looking at thousands of pieces of content a day, like 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of content a day, compared to maybe 30 for the median user. When we look at the comments from those people, it's all caps. It's like rage comments, right? And the crazy thing is that means they're leaving like 100 times as much signal for the AI as the median person, right? So those angry people who can't go to bed are influencing what we all see. So helping people go to bed actually does things like decrease misinformation. That would be my magic bullet.
And one last big question before I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about your nonprofit and we can open up for Q&A. On balance, do you think social media has been good for the world?
Ooh. God, if we could roll back in time. So I always like to say when people are like, hey, what about like the Arab Spring? I'm always like, Arab Spring didn't have algorithms because it was pre-algorithmic home feed. I think it is net on positive but it could be so much more positive. And the only thing I worry about is I worry it has become a crutch for in-person socialization, and especially the usage by kids under the age of 18 means that kids don't get a chance. Like I was an anomaly when I was 13. This is like 1996, because I grew up on the internet. And I remember showing up at college and I had very, very few social skills. Like I didn't know when people were telling jokes. I didn't understand like when people were bored. Like I was like Gen Z. Only when Gen Z shows up to college, I got socialized by my peers who didn't grow up on the internet. Now those kids show up to college and everyone has that experience. So I worry that very soon it will not be net positive, but it has been at least to this point.
And tell us a bit about Beyond the Screen.
So I'm actually very grateful there's a large accounting presence in this audience, because a big part of what we're trying to do is expand what we call the ecosystem of accountability. So we're doing a bunch around developing taxonomies of harm. So what are the harms? Kind of like using Jonathan Haidt's methodology of open literature reviews. We're identifying what are the levers for each harm, and then helping identify strategies for pulling those levers. So for example, on kids harms, people often say, let's keep under 13-year-olds off that platform. Usually that's advocated for by people who don't necessarily understand technology. So they'll say, let's check IDs, which doesn't work, has problems. But if you'd asked a technologist, how can we keep under 13-year-olds off these platforms? They'd say, here's 10 or 15 different ways. The second part that we're doing is we're developing metrics for those harms and those levers, so you can understand the magnitude of the harm on that platform, and how hard are they using the tools that are available to them to provide an incentive for people to actually try to make a dent on these problems.
Great. I'm sure there are a million questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, if you could raise your hand. I can't see very well in the light with the light shining at me, but here, just one over here. Yes.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to hear you speak, and really exciting. I'm looking forward to reading your book or listening to the audiobook, which I hope you narrate.
I do narrate it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. So,
please leave a review. That's all I got to say. Yeah.
So last night, a bunch of us watched this movie from Alex Winters talking about, and the long story short, YouTube is bad. The policy solution is antitrust, break up the big platforms, the big tech firms. What I'm curious about, and so I'm an accounting professor like many of us here. A lot of us have our training in economics. We adopt something called the Lucas critique, where you think about how are folks going to, or entities going to respond to policy changes. And a lot of what we think about are unintended consequences or loopholes, effectively. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts as someone who has the HBS MBA, thinks a lot about algorithms. Would something like Facebook work as a franchise business model, which would basically make, seriously,
sure.
Like you break it up, who cares? It's a franchise, you just license it out to the Norwegian Facebook.
Yeah.
Or would it work, and I'm not familiar if anyone in here who's not in accounting is familiar with the way that the audit firms are organized, which are basically independent country level entities that have a vague part, there's an association. So there's some shared resources, but what I'm really curious about is, essentially, is something like an antitrust solution feasible given loopholes around it involving organizational structure? And the ones that occurred to me were franchising and however the audit firms are organized. I don't know if there's others that would also be, and look, I'm not the smartest one in the room. It took me about 4 seconds to think about those two. I'm sure if you get a couple of lawyers in the room, they'll figure out a way around antitrust for a global organization.
Yeah. So one of the challenges, I think it is logical to look to tools that we have used in the past. But one of the big challenges with social media is its network effects drive it so deeply. It's like you break up YouTube, some of those YouTube babies are going to be more effective than others, and you're just going to have a reconsolidation again. The thing I'm more excited about YouTube competitors is that there are growing alternatives that are creator-owned. And I think that's a super interesting direction. Like right now you have these people who their lives, like their livelihoods depend on YouTube, and they have no influence in how the algorithms work, how their content gets discovered, what happens to them, how they get monetized, if their content gets taken down, if they get demonetized. And there are growing things like CuriosityStream and Nebula are both owned by creators. And they become, I think it's CuriosityStream, it's like a $150 million business now. And that was like founded by a bunch of YouTubers. And I think things like, I know people don't like the word crypto, but I live in Puerto Rico, so I feel like I have to be the advocate occasionally. Having systems where you earn influence, like the ability to say, hey, I contributed something that was consumed a bunch, I get more influence in making these decisions, I think it's a really interesting model to explore. Second thing is was there a second part of your question? It was just antitrust. Oh, for Facebook. I really don't think breaking up Facebook is the solution. You look at what happened with Facebook, and there were countries in 2011 when Google Plus launched where the dominant social network in that country was not Facebook. And the problem is there's enough content that is cross-language, or enough people, speak two languages. They'll speak their local language and they'll speak English. They'll speak their local language, they'll speak Hindi. They'll speak their local language, they'll speak Russian, where people want to be in larger networks. And I think you'll just see, again, a re-amalgamation.
There's a question back here. Yeah.
Hi, well, we have a question from the online audience, which says, if you were to start a new social media platform, what would be the #1 most important aspect that you would think about it? Thank you.
So I like to think about innovation in terms of what's the job to be done. And I think people turn to social media because it depends. There's broadcast social media and there's what I call personal social media. So broadcast social media is you want to go see what an influencer did. You want to go see whatever the latest Mr. Beast is. You don't actually have a relationship with Mr. Beast, no matter what you think. Then there's personal social media, which is I want to know how my cousin is. I want to see the baby photos. I want to know grandma's okay. The design of things like personal social media, I think should be governed differently than broadcast social media. Right? Broadcast social media is something closer to what we have with newspapers, right? We should have transparency on those algorithms because we don't get the asset of real human relationships in terms of keeping those systems safe. When it comes to personal social media, designing social media that is at the scale of human relationships. We've governed church parishes for 2,000 years. We've governed universities, which are 25,000 people, for 1,000 years. We know how to do different levels of governance when they're human-sized numbers of people. And we can design social media where we don't have computers directing our attention, we have humans directing our attention. So an example of this is Discord servers. And yes, there are some very bad Discord servers, but there's less contagion across them. There's systems that are not facilitated because an algorithm thinks you should see this or that. It's because the community is acting together and governing together.
I think there's another one in the front here.
Hi, thank you. Margie from Bluebag. What are your thoughts on Facebook's defense that they often bring up? It's kind of better the devil you know, better us than someone else, or as Nick Clegg often said, better us than China. Do you think that's a good defense? I'd love to hear what you think about it.
So I'm a strong divestment advocate for TikTok. TikTok is, I think, a huge national security liability, given all the whistleblowers that have come out saying, this is a company that is run from inside of China. The CEO in Singapore is basically a figurehead. And there are lots of issues around if China were to start a war, I guarantee you they would not allow distribution of content that was against that war. Right? I think, and given that the fraction of people under the age of 35 that get their news from TikTok goes up every single year, we should all be scared of that and having conversations. But the better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I love how good Facebook is at making false choices, right? They're so good at being you can either have safety or freedom of speech, when there are 20,000 pages of documents saying you have a lot of other options. They're really good at being it's either you let us do whatever we want or China wins. I think in terms of, you actually a really good question earlier, which I didn't answer because it was buried in a larger question, I just realized, which is you said, can they not detect long-term problems? In a system where you govern with metrics, you have to be able to figure out how to measure a long-term reaction to something. And the problem right now is that they only see short-term effects. They have no way of actually valuing longer-term effects. And I think a world where Nick Clegg had to publish numbers, let's say, so the two projects we're doing are called standard of care, that's the taxonomy of harms and levers, and minimum viable queries. In a world where Nick Clegg had to publish the data in minimal viable queries every quarter, every month, so everyone in the world could see it, he would have a more successful long-term business. If he'd had to do that 10 years ago, all of you would still be on Facebook. And I know a bunch of you aren't anymore, right? And it's because Facebook over-optimized for short-term gains at the expense of long-term users.
Some more questions, maybe one back here. Yep.
Hi, Frances. How are you? My name is Abdullahi from the International Chamber of Commerce. We're the largest business organization in the world. One of the projects that we're currently leading is around the cooperation of the future, trying to develop principles around what a more responsible economic and political agent looks like from the private sector. You spoke a bit to the short-termism unique to tech companies with a specific example of committees. Could you maybe go a bit further? Like, what other forces specific to these social media companies still persist that allows for this kind of misinformation to thrive, even though it's sometimes more intuitive to look more long-term and see it as a plus, both in terms of profit, but also credibility and reputation?
I would love to talk to you guys. So my email is frances@franceshaugen.com. And there's a bunch of stuff on like transparency and like organizational effectiveness that I would love to like noodle with you guys on. But I think one of the big challenges is more and more of our economy is going to be run by what I call opaque systems. So I often kind of bristle a little bit when people say my book is about social media, because it's meant to be a book about, we used to have an economy that was about things. 50 years ago, you could buy a car and take it apart. You could confirm that what was in unsafe at any speed was true. Like, you could crash test it yourself. When it comes to a modern world of AI, and it's all running on data centers or on chips, or you have social media platforms, other products that are behind the curtain, they exist beyond where we can inspect them, you will always have a tension where we have lots of mandated metrics we have to report on profitability, on revenue, on expenses, but we don't have to report the social costs that went into getting those numbers. And in a world where we can't do the equivalent of checking for lead paint, where like the physical object, you can check to see if a toy has lead in it. In a world where your children are spending lots and lots of time with digital toys that you can't test, you can't inspect, now that tension, you need to have a really, really good sense of trust that that company is going to behave, right? Because the tension inside the company is always going to be, God, if our numbers, we don't make our numbers this quarter, the stock price is going to go down, or I'm not going to get my bonus, or we're going to get fired. And at Facebook, there is such a fast speed of churn that any problem that is avoided is a hypothetical down the road. The chance that it's really going to hit the skids while you're still in charge is low. When I left Facebook, I was more senior than 80% of all the people in the company, maybe 85%. Like, they had a website you could go look at and see what your percent number was. In a world where being there for 2 years makes you more senior than like 80% of the company, that is a huge, huge national security liability.
Got time for, I think, one last question. Yep, just here.
So I know that at Facebook you were an expert on narrowcasting, and so I have a question.
Oh, I've never gotten a narrowcasting question.
So in academia, there's been an increasing skepticism of, or maybe increasing skepticism of the sort of notion of filter bubbles, right? There's the book, Are Filter Bubbles Real? There's a bunch of academic articles. There's a report from the Reuters Institute here in the UK. And one of the things that I was struck by in your book is you talk about sort of the amount of sort of alternate reality information that's targeted at a very small number of users. Something like 90% of the disinformation was targeted at just 4%, if I'm remembering the figure right, of the Facebook population. And so I can understand academic research that looks at, sort of compares different people's news feeds, different people's search results, different people's Google News search results, that type of thing, and finds very little difference between like sort of what results people are receiving. But when you get to the question of narrowcasting, I mean, there's really, it strikes me that that's the kind of thing that would completely escape most academic studies. There's no way to see when so much of it is targeted to a small number of users. So is there any way to attack that problem from an outside perspective, or is this a big problem with data opacity and there's no way to solve this except finding out the data from the social media companies?
So for context for people, so I came to the company thinking I was actually going to work on the US 2020 election, because I did not get a lot of specificity in my job when I joined. I showed up and found out I was actually going to work on misinformation in places that didn't have third-party fact-checking. So this is like most of the world, it's most of those super vulnerable users. There's not third-party fact-checking in most places, so all of that misinformation, go with God. We got pulled off that project, even though the reason we were doing it was they were worried about another Myanmar. They were worried that Ethiopia would go bad. People's lives were on the line, and we got pulled off it because they found a Russian influence operation that was targeting gay activists, environmentalists, African-American activists, and police officers, right? These are all people who have influence in their communities. And so we got faced with a really hard problem, which is the fact checkers never saw any of that because it's small audience size, right? It goes to a specific community. It's never going to be the most viral item. And a lot of the fact checkers want to show they had really high impact. And so we developed a technology where we said, let's divide the US population into 600 communities. They're about 3 million to 500,000 in size, each of them, based on coherence of the pages and groups they interact with, who they interact with. There are these things called, it's not friend clusters, but it's like basically they've segmented everyone's friend graph. Put all those factors in, we pop you into a cluster. When you looked at who received COVID-19 misinformation, 80% of the misinformation went to populations making up 4% of those communities. Right, so 4% of the US population got 80% of the misinfo. And part of that is things like design, right? When you are in one of those groups, you're in a mom's group that has 100 million people or 100,000 people, and the tenor of that group has become very anti-vaccine. If you question, should I get my kid vaccinated? Their sibling has cancer. People pile on in the comments, and that goes up to the top of the other people's news feeds over and over and over again, right? That's how those phenomena end up happening. I don't think we are going to be able to get that until we get data from the DSA. And it's really, really important when we do the DSA to structure the data asks in a very precise way. So for example, I really believe you need to have something like that segmentation and request data at the level of clusters, because the experience on Facebook is so different cluster to cluster to cluster. And even one of the research papers that came out from the Facebook research today said, the ideological segregation is much, much higher for conservatives in the United States than for other groups, for example. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Frances.
Yeah,
and
my pleasure.
If you want to check out Frances's memoir,
Can I end on a happy note?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so I talk about sad things a lot, and watching you look sad for an hour at a time is hard on me. So we're going to end on a happy note. There have been a lot of new communication technologies over time, right? And every single one of them has been really, really disruptive. The printing press was not actually that disruptive because no one could read, right? It was 3% of Germany could read, right? The thing that was dangerous was teaching people to read. And suddenly you start having pamphlets being printed on how do you know if your neighbor's a witch? What should you do about that? And people listened to these things. It was crazy. We got cheap printing presses, and we got things like wars. People put misinformation in newspapers, and we fought whole wars over it. But we learned, and we responded. We developed journalism schools and journalistic ethics. We started doing things around media concentration laws and ownership disclosure laws. You can't own all the newspapers in the town. We responded. The telegraph was disruptive. Scholars believe it did not cause the Civil War, but it influenced the timing of it, because for the first time, people could tell they didn't agree with people far away. Radio played a huge role in the rise of dictators in World War II. For the first time, people could hear their leaders' voices. That was incredibly effective. But we learned and we responded. We invested in public media, at least in Europe. We doubled down on concentration laws, saying you can't own TV stations and newspapers. We learned and we responded. I think one of the things that's really easy right now is to feel overwhelmed. Someone actually walked up to me outside right before this thing and said, I have been anxious since your question yesterday, which I'm sorry, it's happened sometimes. But I want you guys to remember, it's rational to feel anxious. It's rational to feel overwhelmed, because this is our moment to respond. We are learning. Every single time before, we have learned and we have responded. And so I want you to go forth, and in each of your roles in the ecosystem of accountability, I want to press for the idea that we deserve to democratically govern these systems, because we will respond again. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Frances. Thank you.